advocates for dignity and try and help people.
But Washington says Turkey failed to present any evidence is Jamal Khashoggi-style detention.
Attempt to destroy democracy. It was terrible. I condemned it and I still condemn it.
And our thanks to Professor Sophia Pandya for those insights, drawing on such moving personal experiences from the borders of Greece and Turkey and shared by so many others with whom we're concerned today. Well, it's now my pleasure to welcome our second speaker, a distinguished Australian, Emeritus Professor William Maley of the Australian National University, where he was Professor of Diplomacy from 2002 until just last year, 2021. He's a member of the Order of Australia and a Fellow of the Australian Institute for International Affairs and a recipient of the Paul Cullen Humanitarian Award for Services to Refugees. Professor Maley has a long, active interest in the plight of Afghanistan and is the author of a number of books, including What is a Refugee? Professor William Maley, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Let me begin by quoting from Tolstoy, who in the opening sentence of his great novel Anna Karenina wrote that happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I think that's something that's worth remembering because it draws our attention at the outset to the complexity of life for people who have been displaced and the different experiences which people may endure in the face of rather similar kind of stimuli, that the exact refugee experience is a combination of circumstances plus the capacities of individuals to respond in different ways to those circumstances given their own historical experiences, their own emotional states and whatever. And so it's very difficult in some ways to generalize about refugees and the refugee experience and families because they will be experienced differently by different people. That's certainly been the case in Afghanistan, where displacement has been almost a part of life, if not a way of life, for the best part of 40 years. The major displacement of Afghan refugees actually began following the April 1978 communist coup, and out of a pre-coup population of 13.95 million, by the end of the 1980s, there were over 6 million people living as refugees outside Afghanistan. So there was an enormous amount of displacement from that period, which then affected education of younger generations and human capital formation, and had dramatic social consequences in the long run, which aggravated tensions that might have been there just as a result of the challenges of everyday life. Because everyday life throws up its challenges for families too, but they become multiplied by a kind of logarithmic factor if one is adding massive displacement on top of direct experiences of that sort. And what displacement fundamentally does is tear apart some of the support networks which are fundamentally significant in sustaining families within stable societies. That brings me to a substantive point about Afghanistan and about the definition of family, which it's important to draw. The very idea of family is a complex one. It's one that can vary significantly in the experiences of peoples in different countries, and indeed their conceptions of what the language that they use to describe these kind of networks might actually connote. Family is an English word. There's a Persian word, famil, which seems to be similar, but if you look at the way in which observably family structures function in Afghanistan, they're not just a nuclear family of parents and children. Very often you have a much larger, broader conception of who might be a member of the family. And this can, as a result of consanguinity, stretch out on occasions to embrace relations who in the Australian context would be seen as extremely remote. I remember not long ago remarking to an Afghan friend of mine that cousins were not necessarily close relatives in Australia in the way that they might be in a country like Afghanistan, where a cousin might feel almost like a brother or a sister. And it's partly to do because of patterns of socialization. It's partly to do with geographical spread. In a country like Australia, you can easily have cousins who live on the other side of the continent you might see every few years. In a place like Afghanistan, it's much more likely that even members of an extended family will be concentrated in a particular geographical area, and that will give rise to a sense of family membership and identification that might not be particularly salient in a place like Australia. This can also vary within Afghanistan, depending upon the ethnic group of which one might be a member, because amongst Pashtuns, for example, there tends to be a very strong sense of identity based on the sense of common ancestry, whereas in other groups there may be a much stronger sense of identity based on geography, where fellow villages may be more salient in one's relationships than remote cousins might be. And it can also vary between what happens in urban areas and what happens in rural areas. And in the 1960s, there was actually an expression that was quite common in Afghanistan, marizi famil, or the family sickness, which referred to the difficulties of sustaining models and images of the family that had worked quite well in rural areas when people found their way to the cities, as people were inclined to do at that particular time, and different kind of pressures and influences came into play in order to influence people's day-to-day behaviour. Critical, I think, from an Afghan point of view, is whether relationships give rise to norms of reciprocity. Families can be extremely important if they are underpinned by norms of reciprocity, which mean that they function as mutual support associations for those who are conceived as being part of the membership of the family. And this is why family matters in Afghanistan very much, because when you have state collapse and predatory groups roving the countryside, then one may look to those whom one conceives as family members very much as the network on which one can rely for support if the going gets really rough. And to that extent, disruption of family life tends to be not just a source of sadness, but it tends to be massively dislocating in terms of one's ability to function on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that's come out from a lot of evidence that's been acquired both within Afghanistan and amongst Afghan communities living in exile from Afghanistan. Of course, the exact content of norms of reciprocity can also vary given circumstances and given time, but the passage of time. But it's nonetheless a very important feature to note. And when people find themselves in exile, of course, it may well be that the agencies with which they have to interact, whether we're talking about UNHCR or the agencies of the state in host countries, may be quite insensitive to these kinds of issues. And I'll come back to that in the concluding part of my remarks. In Afghanistan right now, as a result of the Taliban takeover of the country in August last year, there are a number of problems which are afflicting vast numbers of Afghans, irrespective of the character of their families, but which then have the potential to affect the nature of relationships within families as well. One is a corrosive lack of confidence in what the wider world might do to help people of Afghanistan. After all, for decades, Western political leaders quite explicitly made commitments to people in Afghanistan that they would never abandon them. Hillary Clinton met with a group of Afghan women and said, "We will stand with you always." That proved to be quite spurious. When it came to the crunch and the United States got bored, it was happy to cut a deal with the enemy and walk away, which opened the door to the reinstitutionalization of a repressive theocratic tyranny. And many people are now suffering as a result of that, but they are suffering psychologically from the way in which this has reflected or projected into their lives the difficulty of trusting people. Because if you can't trust people who make even very explicit commitments to you, how much trust can you put in things that you might in the past have assumed would be stable sources of support for you and your family members? So there's that problem. There's also the problem of people bitterly falling in on themselves and looking for scapegoats within the country itself to explain the collapse that took place last year, even though the fuse was lit in Washington rather than in Afghanistan. And that then has the effect of creating fairly toxic relations even within extended families. I was talking to an Afghan friend just the other day who is on the receiving end of a feud from a cousin who identifies differently in ethnic terms, as much more sympathetic to the Taliban, and that's creating all sorts of difficulties with which people have to struggle. There are three very specific problems that have arisen as a result of the circumstances of last year. The first is the problem of physical safety. People are being attacked, people are falling victim to terrorist strikes, often on the basis of their ethnicity or their perceived political affiliations. But this has effect on families as well. If you have a bomb attack on a mosque, quite a wide range of people will be killed in all probability. But each one of those persons is a member of a family as well. And that may affect the internal dynamics of the family if a breadwinner is lost, or a beloved parent, or a child. Just as losing a child in Australia is, in a way, every parent's worst nightmare, so it is in Afghanistan too. And it's very difficult for families to pick up and move forward when they're coping with the overwhelming grief that these kind of attacks can produce. And we're also seeing mass atrocity crimes such as the killing of Panjshiris and people in Underob and places like that just in recent days, which again have very similar effects. The atrocity prevention project of the Australian National University, even before the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, ranked Afghanistan in the top 5 countries at risk of genocide or politicide in the period in 2023 to 2024. And that's because it ticks all the boxes for mass atrocity crime. If you look at early warning statistical models that have been developed with great sophistication by scholars working in this particular area. So that's a danger that families confront at the moment. A second problem is the problem of destitution. And it's a political problem. It's not just an economic or a humanitarian assistance problem. And it reflects the fact that large numbers of families for a couple of decades were sustained by international aid that provided the salaries for people who worked in bureaucratic agencies, which then sustained often extended families rather than just nuclear families. Now, because of the obnoxious character of the Taliban, no Western government is remotely likely to be prepared to provide aid of that sort, to provide salary support for what could turn into an agency of state repression. But that does mean that there's been a huge collapse in purchasing power within Afghanistan, which then affects not just those who've lost purchasing power, but those whose goods and services would have been purchased. And so there's a broader economic problem here. Some of the people who are most gravely affected under these circumstances were women who had been heads of households. There are lots of widows in Afghanistan who are actually heads of household, but who were working in state agencies, and they've now been sent home by the Taliban as a result of the misogynist policies which are very much on display and widely reported coming out at the moment. The notion that there was going to be a different kind of Taliban this time around, a Taliban 2.0, has proved to be wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety. And women, and particularly women heads of household, are in a desperate situation as a result of that. And probably the most useful aid that one can supply at the moment is not top-down aid, but bottom-up aid that tries to get assistance directly to people in that situation through the sort of informal money transfer system known as Hawala. Then there's a third problem, and I foreshadowed this earlier, which is for people who are fleeing Afghanistan. About 1 million people have fled since August last year, but they haven't received a lot of attention yet in Western countries because a lot of them have only made their way into Iran. But if the numbers go up dramatically, it could well be that the Iranians and other countries that see themselves as countries of transit might decide that they want to open the borders rather than close them, in which case the Europeans might be confronted with the challenge of whether they're prepared to be as generous towards people from the Middle East as they have been towards people fleeing Ukraine following the Russian invasion on the 24th of February. But a greater problem there is that the conception of family, which tends to be applied by Western bureaucracies and which can be relevant, for example, if people are seeking to use sponsorship mechanisms to reunite fractured or separated families, is that the Western model is very often nuclear in character. And so when people who might be desperately worried about a cousin or an aunt or an uncle with whom they might have grown up all their lives in the one house, take their concerns to bureaucracies, they risk being told that people like that don't qualify to be sponsored for resettlement. And there's no particular likelihood that we're going to see Western bureaucracies change in this respect, because they're also looking over their shoulder at populist political forces domestically that have never been particularly enthusiastic about receiving refugees from countries like Afghanistan. Now, one hopes the story is apocryphal, but there were actually reports coming out at the time of the evacuation through Kabul airport last year of families turning up with 5 or 6 children and being told that they were only allowed to take 2 children onto the flight and they would have to choose which ones would go with them, which is somewhat treats children as if they're like checked in baggage and one item of hand luggage allowed on the plane. Really, it's fairly scary. And that kind of problem is one which is looming for people who have fled Afghanistan who feel that they are likely to be forced to flee in the near future. And what it reflects is the point with which I opened, that there are different conceptions of what the family embraces in different parts of the world. And it's actually important that there be some attempt to bridge the gulf in understanding about the meaning of the family between different parts of the world if more horrors are not going to flow from the application of bureaucratic criteria for resettlement, which we know in the 1930s stopped Jews from being resettled, not in terms of family size, but in terms of quotas for resettlement, with truly horrific consequences that flowed from the perception that following the rules was more important than helping the vulnerable.
Professor William Maley, thanks for that. Let me ask you just a couple of questions. Given that Australia, for instance, is facing a new federal election in just a few days' time, an incoming government is faced with some promises, legacy promises from the previous government about the number of Afghan refugees who are going to be admitted to the country. What would your immediate recommendations to any new government be?
Well, I think cutting through red tape is tremendously important at the moment, because very few people who've applied under special humanitarian program visas have actually been resettled so far. And they're all in pretty desperate circumstances waiting for resettlement. So cutting through some of the really pointless bureaucracy which is delaying the process of resettlement would be a good starting point. And that requires also putting more resources into processing, because we know that even though the current government, with support from the opposition, has committed to providing thousands more places than were initially provider, the applications that have thus far received cover 132,000 people. So even in the best of circumstances, only a small fraction of those who were in effect invited to apply for resettlement have much prospect of obtaining resettlement. And frankly, that's one reason why when people have approached me, I've suggested they go to Canada rather than if they can manage it, rather than apply for Australia, because realistically, unless there is a significant increase in the number of people to be resettled from Afghanistan, most people will end up being disappointed. I think there is actually a very strong moral case for resettling far more from Afghanistan than any political party has thus far committed to do. And that's partly because we were also party to assuring the Afghans that they would not be abandoned. We actually know from some notes kept by the late Richard Holbrooke that when he put to the current US President Biden, Vice President at the time, that the United States might owe obligations towards people in Afghanistan who had trusted the Americans and prominently supported them, Biden's response was, we don't have to worry about that. Nixon and Kissinger got away with it in South Vietnam, where lots of people got.
Just one final question on that. Do you think there is anything structurally wrong with the way Australia is processing its responsibility towards Afghan refugees at the moment, particularly in light of what you've had to say about the nature of the understanding of family?
Look, I think there is. I think there needs to be a greater sensitivity to the extent to which, for people in Afghanistan, being resettled, if large numbers of intimate relatives from their point of view are left behind, is nowhere near the panacea for their problems that officials in a country like Australia might expect. Being resettled as a refugee can be a profoundly disempowering experience anyway. And if one feels a responsibility for people who've been left behind, that adds to the sense of traumatic disempowerment which people have to carry with them. So I think really a radical rethink of how this issue should be approached is very important. There are actually some good recommendations as a starting point from the interim and final reports of the inquiry into Afghanistan by the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee that came out late last year. The first report signed by the late Senator Kimberly Kitching and the second by Senator Eric Abetz. I mention that because both were consensus reports with no dissenting reports. And so there is, I think, some consensus within the Parliament for doing more and better than has been promised so far, but I think even more will be required in the long run.
Emeritus Professor William Maley, thanks so much for joining us for this discussion and sharing so much of your wisdom with us. It's been great to have you.
My pleasure.